On December 17th, 1944, more than 100 American prisoners stood in a Belgian field with their hands in the air. They were not charging a hill. They were not storming a village. Most of them were artillery observers, drivers, cooks, surveyors, men who had expected a road movement through the Ardennes, not a meeting with the armored spearhead of Hitler's last gamble in the West. The field was near a crossroads called Bulge, just outside Malmedy, and the unit holding them was Kampfgruppe Peiper. A few minutes later, that snowy field became a killing ground. Machine guns opened on the prisoners. Men dropped into the snow. Some ran. Some froze. Some survived only because they let their own bodies become part of the pile. When the firing stopped, SS soldiers moved between the fallen and shot the living at close range. 84 American prisoners of war died there. The Malmedy massacre did not just become one of the darkest crimes committed against American troops in Europe. It changed the emotional weather of the battlefield. Because news of the massacre moved faster than any official report. It moved by radio. It moved by rumor. It moved from frozen foxholes to command posts, from tank crews to rifle companies, from men who had never seen the field to men who suddenly imagined themselves standing in it. And in the days that followed, a dangerous question began spreading with it. If the enemy murders men who surrender, what are American soldiers supposed to do when Germans surrender to them? This is not a clean story. It is the story of two frozen fields, one at Malmedy, one at Chenogne. It is the story of George Patton's Third Army, the Battle of the Bulge, and a line in Patton's own diary that still feels like it should stop the room when it is read aloud. I hope we can conceal this. To understand why that line matters, you have to go back one day before the massacre. On December 16, 1944, Adolf Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive, the attack Americans would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was enormous, risky, and desperate. German forces would punch through thin American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, rush west toward the Meuse River, and ultimately try to retake Antwerp. If the plan worked, it would split the British and American armies and buy Nazi Germany time it no longer had. The sector had been treated as quiet. That was part of the danger. Some American units there were exhausted divisions sent to rest after brutal fighting elsewhere. Others were green troops still learning what combat really meant. Then the forest erupted. Roughly 200,000 German soldiers, backed by armor, artillery, and surprise, slammed into a winter front that was never meant to absorb such a blow. The weather made everything worse. Fog and snow shut down Allied air power in the first critical days. Roads froze, engines failed, men woke with frostbite. The woods swallowed sound until a tank seemed to appear out of the trees already too close. At the northern shoulder of the attack was the 6th Panzer Army. At the tip of that thrust was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a fast armored battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division. Its job was speed, not caution, not consolidation. Speed. Every bridge delayed them. Every traffic jam weakened the offensive. Every prisoner required guards, paperwork, movement to the rear, and time that Peiper believed he did not have. That does not excuse what happened at Malmedy. It explains the command climate that made it possible. Kampfgruppe Peiper had already been moving with a brutality that treated civilians, stragglers, and prisoners as obstacles. And at Bulge, that logic reached its clearest form. The Americans captured there belonged mainly to Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. They were moving in a convoy when they ran into the German armored column. They fired briefly, then the situation became hopeless. So they surrendered. They were searched. Some had cigarettes and watches taken. They were herded into a field beside the road. Then the guns came up. There was no trial, no march to the rear, no confusion that can make the event disappear into the fog of combat. Survivors later described lying motionless under bodies, holding their breath in the cold while German soldiers stepped through the dead and fired into anyone who moved. That afternoon, 84 Americans were killed. Their bodies stayed in the snow for weeks because the ground remained behind German lines. But the story did not stay there. By the time those bodies were recovered in January, the massacre had already entered the bloodstream of the American army. And that is where the story turns. About 140 miles to the south, George S. Patton's Third Army had been fighting toward the Saar. When the scale of the German breakthrough became clear, Patton was ordered to do something that looked almost impossible on a map. He had to stop one campaign, turn major formations 90 degrees, and drive north through ice, traffic, and winter chaos to relieve Bastogne. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st Airborne and other American units inside the town were holding a road junction the Germans needed badly. Patton moved faster than his enemies expected, and faster than many of his own officers believed he could. On December 26, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. That achievement was real. Patton's operational skill was real. His speed, nerve, and appetite for movement mattered. The Third Army's turn north remains one of the most famous maneuvers of the campaign. But victory did not purify the battlefield around it. By the final days of December, anger over Malmedy had mixed with exhaustion, fear, cold, and revenge. Some American units received formal instructions that no SS troops or paratroopers were to be taken prisoner. In at least one regiment, that order survived on paper. In other places, the message seems to have traveled without paper. Not always as an official command, not always as a signed order, but as a battlefield understanding. The normal rules have been damaged, and once that happens, the damage does not stay neatly pointed at the guilty. That is the part many retellings miss. Because the Germans who would die at Chenogne were not the men of Kampfgruppe Piper. They were not the same SS troops who had murdered the Americans at Malmedy. Many were regular army soldiers. Some belonged to formations fighting around Bastogne. Some accounts describe medics attempting to surrender under a Red Cross flag. But by New Year's Day, 1945, the rage that Malmedy created had outgrown the facts of Malmedy itself. On January 1st, elements of the U.S. 11th Armored Division fought to retake Chenogne, a small Belgian village about 5 miles from Bastogne. The fight was savage. The village had been battered by artillery and fought over in brutal close combat. Houses became firing points. Roads became kill zones. Men were fighting in freezing conditions, often with poor visibility, against defenders who did not simply vanish when a line on a map changed color. By the time the fighting eased, American troops had taken a group of German prisoners. The exact number varies by account. Some estimates are lower. Many modern discussions put the number around 60 to 80. What matters is not only the number. What matters is what happened next. The prisoners were moved into a field. There was no proper evacuation to the rear, no meaningful processing, no serious attempt to treat them as prisoners of war. American soldiers opened fire. This was not the Malmedy massacre. It was its echo. And that echo was still a crime. For decades, Chenogne lived in the shadows of the war. It did not become a famous photograph. It did not enter American memory the way Malmedy did. It did not receive the same prosecution, the same public reckoning, or the same moral clarity. But witnesses remembered. One account described German prisoners being marched up a hill in groups. Another described dozens being machine-gunned by men of the 11th Armored Division. The records were thin. The paperwork almost vanished. No officer signed a simple sentence saying, "Kill them." That absence is important, but it is not the same as innocence. Because war crimes often do not need a neat written order to happen. They need permission in the air. They need anger that has become policy without admitting it is policy. They need soldiers to believe no one above them really wants the truth written down. And then, within days, Patton learned enough. On January 4th, 1945, Patton wrote in his diary about the 11th Armored Division. He called the division very green. He criticized its losses. Then he added the line that will not go away. Also murdered 50-odd German med. I hope we can conceal this. The word med appears to mean medics. Read the sentence carefully. Patton did not write that enemy soldiers had been lawfully shot. He did not describe a confused battlefield exchange. He did not frame it as clean reprisal. He used the word murdered. And his next instinct, in his own private writing, was not investigation, it was concealment. That is why the diary matters. It does not prove that Patton personally ordered the killing at Chenogne. No surviving written order shows that. But it proves something else. It proves that Patton knew, very quickly, that something resembling murder had taken place under his command. It proves he understood the moral category of the act, and it proves that his recorded instinct was to hope it could be hidden. That is command responsibility at its most uncomfortable. Not because every crime requires a general's signature, but because a general's silence can become a signal. No serious American prosecution followed. No major court-martial punished the killings at Chenogne. After the war, when investigators looked again, the trail was already cold. Units had been broken up. Records were incomplete. The moment had passed into a fog that was very useful to everyone who wanted it to stay there. Years later, Ben Ferencz, the youngest prosecutor at Nuremberg, reviewed the declassified material and reached a blunt conclusion. It smelled like a cover-up. That accusation matters because the United States military justice system was perfectly capable of prosecuting war crimes when the accused were German. Joachim Peiper was tried after the war. The Malmedy massacre became part of the Allied record of Nazi brutality. German officers and soldiers were called to account for atrocities across Europe, and they should have been. But the field at Chenogne did not receive the same machinery of justice. That is the moral break in the story. Not that American soldiers were just as bad as the SS. That is false. Not that Malmedy and Chenogne were identical in origin, scale, or ideology. They were not. The break is smaller, sharper, and harder to escape. An atrocity committed by the enemy does not give an army permission to become careless with its own soul. And that is what makes Patton such a difficult figure here. Because the same man who hoped Chenogne could be concealed would soon help make sure another horror could never be denied. On April 4th, 1945, soldiers from Patton's Third Army reached Ohrdruf, a satellite camp of the Buchenwald system near Gotha, Germany. It was the first Nazi concentration camp liberated by American forces. The soldiers who entered found a world built around degradation and murder. Bodies lay in the open. Others had been stacked in sheds. There were instruments of torture, gallows, and evidence of forced labor and starvation. Many of the Americans did not have words for what they saw. On April 12th, Dwight Eisenhower came to Ohrdruf with Patton and Omar Bradley. Eisenhower wanted witnesses. He wanted photographs. He wanted film. He wanted journalists and soldiers to see it with their own eyes, because he already understood that someday people would try to deny it. Patton, a man famous for aggression and swagger, reportedly became physically sickened by the camp. He later ordered German civilians from nearby communities to walk through and confront what had been done in their name. After Buchenwald was found, civilians from Weimar were also forced to see the evidence. That was not theater. That was historical preservation under emotional shock. It was one of the most important things Allied commanders did in the final weeks of the war. They made the crime visible before the world could look away. So the record leaves us with a contradiction. Patton tried to hide an American crime at Chenogne. Patton helped expose German crimes at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. Both are true, and neither one cancels the other. That is not a comfortable way to remember a famous commander, but it is a more honest one. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton's troubles did not come from Chenogne. They came during the occupation. He became military governor of Bavaria, where he was responsible for helping carry out denazification policy. Patton disliked the assignment, distrusted parts of the policy, and made public comments that minimized the significance of former Nazi Party membership. Eisenhower finally removed him from command of Third Army. The formal change came in October 1945. Patton was reassigned to the 15th Army, an administrative post. Then, on December 9, 1945, Patton was riding to go pheasant hunting when his Cadillac collided with an Army truck. He was thrown forward and suffered a severe spinal injury. For 12 days he remained conscious but paralyzed. On December 21st, a pulmonary embolism killed him. He was 60 years old. Patton was buried at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army. His grave is marked by a white cross, like the thousands around it. That image is simple. The history beneath it is not. The Battle of the Bulge produced genuine courage, real sacrifice, and operational brilliance. It also produced crimes, panic, retaliation, and moments when discipline broke under the weight of what men had seen and heard. Malmedy was an atrocity. Chenogne was also an atrocity. The first explains the fury behind the second. It does not excuse it. And Patton's diary does not let us pretend the command did not know the difference. The hard truth is that democracies do not prove their values only when the enemy behaves honorably. They prove them when the enemy has made honor feel impossible. That was the test in the Ardennes. In one snowy field, American prisoners were murdered by the enemy. In another, German prisoners were murdered by Americans. Between those two fields stands Patton, brilliant, ruthless, sickened by Nazi crimes, and willing to hide a crime committed under his own command. That is the record, not the legend, not the excuse, the record. A crime in one field did not pardon a crime in another.